the flight that I was originally going to be.
Hopefully she had a better experience than you did.
Yes, her flight left on time.
We are recording, everybody. Should be ready to go for today's webinar.
Perfect. Jay, do you want me to wait a couple minutes for a few more people or kick it off?
Derek, what do you think?
I think we should get started.
All right,
Okay.
let's do it. Okay, thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. This is put on by the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows. I am Linnea Hance and I will be the moderator for today. I think you all will really enjoy this discussion. I will do my best to monitor any questions in the chat or the Q&A portion of Zoom, but if not, I'll circle back at the end and make sure everything has been addressed. So let's go for it. Today's session is going to focus on the topic of how to measure return on investment of a company's CI function. So this is a topic that's really gotten a lot of intense interest from companies and CI practitioners. It's also sort of one of those elusive topics that it's a little bit hard to get a straight answer on how to go about quantifying a numeric measurement of that investment. So today, Jay Nakagawa is going to be talking about this topic. He was inducted into the Council of CI Fellows last year. For the past 11 years, he's been the Director of Competitive Intelligence for Dell Technologies. And prior to that, spent 20 years as a product manager in the technology sector. He also has background in systems engineering, sales, business development, marketing. So he really brings a very broad background to the webinar today and this discussion on ROI. Jay, welcome to today's session. The subject of ROI seems to be something that everyone really wants to know about, but doesn't know how to really approach, especially when it comes to measuring your CI function. So how was it that you arrived at the idea to discuss this topic today?
That's a great question there, Linnea. It comes from the whole, as you said, my background is product management, and within the product management realm, we always have to provide an ROI on any project because people are going to evaluate, from a company standpoint, should we invest in this project or that project? So it's always been a function I've had to do anyway. But in the context of competitive intelligence, it's a little bit more loosey-goosey. And so we started putting together, with my guidance with the team, we started putting together some framework that we could use, and that's something as a framework, it could be reused on a regular basis. It was a technique that could be used. And I'll give some examples this morning. But it comes down to the old adage about if you can't measure it, how do you know if it's really working? So that's been one of the tenets behind this.
Do you feel like people kind of shy away from this question, and why is that? Not even just in CI, but in ROI in general. I think it's something that provides a lot of value, but it may, make people a little hesitant about the topic.
That's a really good point. And what happened is when I was the chairman of the Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professionals Association, otherwise known as SKIP, I would get a lot of questions, as well as Lori Young and other members of the advisory board, about how do we go about measuring return on investment, and especially in today's world. A lot of managers and a lot of different companies, and I still hear from a lot of people who are CI practitioners, they're saying like, well, my manager's saying we can replace the CI function with AI. And while I think, there's certainly some aspects of that can meaning using AI that can enhance CI, it certainly is not going to replace it. So one of the things is, how can you demonstrate a return on investment on the CI function in such a manner that it's understood by the executive, it's understood by the finance team, it's understood by those around you. And that was really the key behind it was, and from our company standpoint, Michael Dell is a fanatic about being able to measure things. And so from that standpoint, Michael is really pressing us all the time to try and figure out what is the return on investment. That's how a lot of this got born over time. Let me give you an example here. So if you show most people this particular chart or this particular picture. They basically throw their hands up and they say, this is really a way of measuring rate of return and how to calculate it. But when people see the subscripts there, and it just turns the brain off, and people go like, they throw their hands up because it looks very difficult. And there's actually a well-rooted reason behind that. So there's a psychologist who recently passed away named Daniel Kahneman, and he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And what Danny did is he can put together a construct of how the brain works. And so he said there's a system 1 construct of the brain, there's a system 2 construct of the brain, which should not be confused with systems thinking. That's completely different. But it was a way of being able to explain why your brain reacts to things like this particular formula. So system 1 is the intuitive side of what we do. It's intuitive. It correlates information very quickly. It reaches conclusions, but it's also not very accurate. In order to get the accuracy, you have to actually invoke the system 2 part of your brain, which is basically a very lazy part. It doesn't like being invoked. It can figure out things if you give it a formula like this, but the initial reaction, the visceral reaction people have when they see a particular formula like this is that it's too hard. I don't want, and that's the system 2 brain going like, I don't want to put the effort into this. Now, what's interesting is that we are all subject to system 1 and system 2 constructs and the habits of those parts of the brain. For example, if you're driving home at night, that's mainly system 1. As a matter of fact, there's been studies that say up to 87% of a person's day is spent on system 1. You're driving home, and system 2 is only invoked when that car swerves into your lane unexpectedly, or the kid, rides a bike in front of your car and shoots out from the middle of nowhere. That's your system 2 reacting. But we're all subject to the issues of system 1 and system 2 thinking. So as I was looking at this, we started saying, okay, how can we make this easier for people to accept? And if you compare this chart to the previous one, return on investment is net profit divided by the cost of investment times 100%. And because of its simplicity, this is when the brain says, yes, I can do this. This makes sense. It's easier. So you actually don't have as much system 2 kicking back. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. They have taken studies where you take system 2 brainwaves, and they can actually measure increased heart rate, increased pulse, and it's very stressful on the body. So if you think about the previous formula, and now you look at this one, this is when your brain says, this really isn't too bad. So it's easier to conceptualize and understand.
Yeah, I definitely can see the visceral reaction happening from a lot of people. I was having some flashbacks myself when I first saw that slide. So back to, physics class and doing that and trying to wrap your head around it. So can you tell us a little more about sort of the framework and background of how you got to this?
Sure. And let me bring up the framework as a matter of fact. So to make it simple, that everybody could use it, and I don't want to make it sound like this is the end all be all of framework for measuring ROI. It is one approach that we developed and have been able to use it successfully in a repeated manner. So we said, okay, first of all, you have to establish a baseline, and that baseline is what are you doing today? And my experience has found that when other CI practitioners have problems, it's because they went and did a project without first establishing what that baseline was today. And that's a really important part because you can't measure that delta unless you actually do the measurement today. Once you've done a baseline, then you identify the costs associated with the activity. Again, if you can't measure it, then you can't tell what the real delta is. Then you figure out what is your action benefit and then calculate your return on investment. So this is, I guess let me jump into this. So establishing a baseline, I'm going to give an example that's from our organization, what we did. And again, if you can't measure it, how do you know when you're going to be successful? So establishing a baseline at the start of a process is really important. And by the way, I did this presentation last fall at a conference in Berlin, and it prompted a lot of talk because people were going like, I can actually use this framework now, take it back to my job because it's actually simple. I can understand it and I can articulate how we got to a measurement. So let's take a look at the example here. And these are typically focused on a couple of areas, one being reduced cost, the other being increased revenue. And those are very, very common. So let's say at the end of the quarter, we're doing end of quarter processing on competitive information, win losses, et cetera. What is the trending behind that? And the numbers are slightly different than this. We actually had more people, but for sake of being simple, I said, okay, let's say we have 4 competitive intelligence analysts. At the end of the quarter, it takes 10 business days to put the information together. And it takes 8 hours per day. So baseline here is the 320 people hours. So that's really the baseline. And that's where we're going to start from. Next, if we go to the identify cost metrics, now you're looking at things like cost per hour. What is the cost per employee? And that should be frankly, a fully burdened cost that includes fringe benefits, et cetera. Investment of costs in tools if you're going to acquire a tool to help you out. You should be able to measure what is the time required for certain tasks or there are other acquisition costs, et cetera. Will this result in an increase or decrease in headcount? So what we did here is we're going to take the example we just got through, 320 people hours, and let's suppose, for sake of argument, that each person on the team, the 4 analysts, costs fully burdened 175,000 K. Well, then you have to divide that by 2,080 hours. And some of you are going to be going like, where did you get that from? My wife, she was in payroll for years. I mean, she did that for a career. And so I know from the formula that the payroll people use, and again, this is only for the US and probably Canada. So if you're in a different part of the world or you have a different metric for a typical number of hours worked per year, certainly plug that in. But if we use 2080, that comes out to an equivalent hourly rate of $84.13. I think somebody just rang my doorbell, but I'm going to ignore them. So if we take that 84.13 times 4 people, that comes out to be $336 per hour to generate the quarterly report. Again, just simple math. And that's what makes the framework so accessible, is it is just, basics. So if we take that 336 times 10 working days times 8 hours per day, that's close to 27,000 each quarter to produce this report. Now, if you annualize that, so just over 100,000 at 107,000 K to annually produce a report. So now we've got some real metrics. We can actually apply real cost numbers to the cost of having to do this. So this is your baseline. If we look at step 3, it's really about the action benefit. So these are foundational measurements in terms of, are we going to try and improve revenue? Is it net new revenue? Is it incremental revenue? Is it resulting in an increased NPS score? And I won't go down that rabbit hole because there's a lot of issues, in my opinion, about NPS scores. But anyway, what are the increased efficiencies or reduced costs from taking this action? Is there an increase in your market penetration? Is there reduced expenses? So now we're going to take a look at this. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that we've decided we're going to acquire a tool. Because if you think about this, in the old world, meaning the previous slides, we actually were spending a lot of time processing the data. And so it was taking the Excel spreadsheets that were extracted from a data lake, and then you have to filter it, and then you have to sort it, and then you have to process it. That's what took actually so long. So he said, what happens if we take a particular tool, and it could be something like a Microsoft Power BI, it could be something like Tableau, it could be something like Domo, to instead do that processing for us so we can automate the feeding of that data. Instead of going to Excel, it goes into a tool. We actually were able to figure out that rather than having multiple people working off for multiple hours over multiple days, that we could get down to one person in basically 5 hours, because this team member was spending the time interpreting the data and the results instead of processing the data. So if we take a look at that 84.13, again, that hourly rate, which is now 5 hours, it's $420 and change. at the end of the quarter to create that report. Times 4 quarters, new annualized cost of 1682, which means if you take the cost of the tool plus the cost of the annualized cost for each quarter, it's now gone down to 28,000. So a significant, reduction in the cost and time taken to do that. Now we get to the point where we say, okay, the cost savings per year is 79,000 compared to the 107,000 before. Huge savings. So now how do you calculate the ROI? And we're going to do that. It's pretty simple. Again, going back to the formula we showed earlier, not the complex one, but the simple one. So you take away 1 minus 5 hours, meaning the new time to create the report, divided by the old time to create the report. And that's a 98% efficiency improvement. That's huge. And that's actually real numbers that we saw. Net benefit divided by total cost, you end up with a return on investment of 275. And this is all simple math. And that's the beauty of this framework, is that it doesn't require, unnatural acts or unnatural thinking habits. It's all simple math. And that's where the power of this really comes into play. So what happens, we're able to get the report into the executive's hands faster, and the result, they can make better decisions sooner. So this becomes your new baseline. Whenever you make a huge improvement like that, it's hard to make similar improvements. So in this case, this was a kind of a one and done. But because the reporting was repeatable every quarter, we were able to, provide the report sooner, at less expense, and more accurately, frankly.
Yeah, it definitely seems more simple once you walk through it. Once you have the data, you just plug it in. It's, pretty straightforward. I also like the comment about the new baseline. That's huge. Continuous improvement. You don't want to measure yourself on where you started. You want to measure yourself on, how far you've come, for sure. And it feels like, we could turn around and apply this to a project today if we
Yes.
want it.
As a matter of fact, that's a great point there, Linnea. A lot of times, and this goes back to when I was the chairman of SCIP, you get the very broad question about how do I measure return of investment on the CI function? And what we determined early on is that that's too broad of a thing to try and measure. It's too difficult to measure that entire spectrum as one lump sum. So we said, if we break it down to each project, we can actually measure each project individually. And, at some point, you start realizing that the improvements are all positive ROI. And as a result, you know it's a positive number, but I don't think there's a practical way, frankly, to be able to quantify it across an entire organization, because there's just so many projects that are ongoing. Let me give you an example here. So for a lot of CI people, especially if they're using tools out there like Clue or Crayon or Quantify or Clods or any of that, they're really talking about battle card asset creation. So let's take an example here. Let's suppose it takes 16 hours, and I'll just use me as an example. It might take me 16 hours to create a battle card, and then 2 hours each quarter to update, because we want to make sure, just like the beer commercials, you have a freshness state, right? So you want to have freshness, and you want to know the information that's up to date. Well, okay, so 16 hours to create it, and then 2 hours per quarter to update it. Okay, again, let's go back to the formula: $175,000 per person, 80 hours per year. Again, the hourly rate of 84. So at least we're consistent there. So $84 times the initial cost of 16 hours to create that, $1,300 to create the asset, plus $168 each quarter to update, for an annualized cost of $1,850. Again, simple math. That's the beauty of this, is that it can be, and it should be, frankly, this simple. I remember when I was getting both my undergraduate in business and my MBA, formulas can get very complex, and I don't think they need to be, especially for a CI practitioner, because this should all be simple math to do. So here's what we got so far. Let's suppose we've got 85 of these assets now at $1,850 per asset. over a year, that's $157,000. So not a huge amount of cost, but there's some cost there. The real question comes on this side. Calculating the benefits and return on CI.
Mhm.
And so for this example, let's suppose you're in a fairly, mid-sized company and your annual revenue improves from 50 to 52 million. And this is, again, comparing pre-battle card and post-battle card. I think you'll find people out there arguing that the battle card themselves aren't responsible for the increase in revenue, but they certainly help. And there's ways to actually measure the usage of an asset and how it's affecting the ROI and revenue being generated. So we take this 52 million, divide by 50 million. So again, the new revenue divided by the old -1 is a 4% improvement. So if we look at sales growth minus the cost of asset, again, simple math, divide by the cost of the asset, it's a ROI of 1,171. Okay, so we all know somebody in sales or marketing or wherever is going to say, that's total nonsense. I don't believe that. Well, even if it's only 25%, that's still 293% ROI. Let's suppose they say it's only 10% of that. It's still a positive number. So what you want to avoid is getting to the negative number, but anything north of zero is a good thing. And it has to do a lot with how we think about wins and losses and basically it has a lot to do with the psychology behind that. But in any case, any number north of zero is actually good.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Jay, you mentioned consistency across the organization. We have a comment from Tom Tao mentioning that we're assuming the quality of the report done by one person with a certain platform is the same as the report done by 4 other analysts. Any comments on that real quick?
Yeah, I mean, like I manage a team of 20, 21 people, and we've actually put some specific guidelines and expectations of what the quality is, the thoroughness of the product, whether it be a battle card, whether it be a deep dive deck. And so we've actually established some guidelines around that to ensure consistency. I, as a manager, have to review it. And if I think there are things missing, it gets sent back and they have to rework it. But at some point, the team really starts understanding the expectation of what they're creating and how they create it and the
Sure.
level of content. And really, it has to do with being able to justify and, cite the sources to make sure it's accurate. But yeah, I mean, it can be a challenge if you have a team that you're really not watching very closely, but that's not my experience with my team.
Sure. Okay, no, thank you. I think going back to the 2 examples you gave, both of those I think are great examples. Maybe a question people are asking right now is, how do you do this for, this is a short-term project. How is this compared to medium and long-term projects? Is it the same? Is it not? Do you approach it a little bit differently? How would you go about that?
Okay, good question. I tend to think of it this way. We're in the middle of hurricane season, right?
Mhm.
As a matter of fact, we were just down in Florida, and after the storm had come through, it was pretty muggy. But if you think about the Weather Channel, when they put up the hurricane charts, it's usually, for within the first 24 to 36 hours, they've got a pretty good idea of where that hurricane is at. And as the days go out, day 2, day 3, day 4, through day 7, that cone gets wider. And that's a reflection of the unpredictability of, or lack of confidence, perhaps, in charting the direction of the storm and where it's going to go. So you can think of the similar principle here. And one of the things we try and do, or at least that we try and do within the company I'm with, is we actually try and use a lot of things about assumptions, blind spots, scenarios, and we try and actually make it the reverse so that today, over on the left-hand side, we have known knowns, and we try and anticipate, what is the, what things are we not thinking about? As a matter of fact, there's a really good article in one of the books I just read where they talk about, we're all familiar with the term postmortem, right? It has to do with examining, a body after it's been dead. But there's a concept, and I think it's very clever. It's called premortem. So at the beginning of a project, and this is what we do. At the beginning of a project, we have certain assumptions. We look at what we're doing, and we say, okay, let's assume that, and we make our forecasts. Here's what we think the ROI is. Here's how long we think it's going to take. Here's how much resources we need. And it's always a balancing act because the number of projects that people want from a CI function will always outstrip the amount of resources you have. So we try and take due diligence in putting this together, but we came up with this idea that if we take this information and we list it out and we do a pre-mortem, we say, okay, based upon what we think about this project, here's what we think it's going to be an ROI, resources needed, date delivered. And, that's assuming initially, at least, that there's no scope creep in that. We take that and then we do a pre-mortem on it. We say, okay, let's assume that the project is 12 to 18 months long in duration. The scenario goes like this. At the end of that 12 to 18 months, everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong. What things should we have known when we were examining this chart here towards the beginning? What things did we not take into account that led to the failure? And so it's a way of trying to understand the variables that can affect you before you actually have to do with it, before you actually have to deal with it. It's a better way of planning, in my opinion, because once you assume that the project has failed, say, oh, well, we should have probably looked at this or we should have looked at that. So it's a good way of doing that. And we actually end up spending a lot of time right there in that section between assumptions and scenarios, iterating to get a better outcome. And so this is how we approach it within the team. So far, it's been working pretty well. And I think, so this is good for medium term, because I think at least to a degree, you've got certain things that you know. Longer term, I'm thinking, okay, 5 years out. So this goes back to my product management background. So it was interesting. I worked for a guy named Frank Slootman. Frank went on to be the CEO of Data Domain, a company called ServiceNow and Snowflake. And Frank said, okay, and I had known Frank from the mid 1990s. So we're familiar with each other. And I said, I know what my title is. What do you want me to do? He goes, well, I need for you to make a decision. Either we need to acquire a company or we need to do a meet in the channel, which we're doing today, or we don't do anything and I'll find you another job in the company. And as a product manager, it's very rare to get that kind of offer. And so Frank said, okay, make a recommendation. This is like around May 10th. I said, when do you need this by? He goes, oh, end of the month. And I'm counting the days going like, well, I'm going to be pretty busy for the next 3 weeks, including weekends. He goes, oh, by the way, I also need pro forma financials from you. So again, you could see that system 2 going into complete panic mode in my brain. Long story short, did it. And I sat down with Frank. I said, we need to do an acquisition of this. And I said, let me make clear up front, though, this is not a strategic product, nor is it a strategic acquisition. Again, we went through a lot of the techniques here about understanding, with the scenarios, the potential downsides. And so we were very careful about that. And he goes, well, okay, for sake of argument, what do you think this is going to cost? I said, less than 50 million for the acquisition. He goes, well, what are you committing to in terms of revenue? I said, 300 million over 5 years. And Frank, just being Frank, because he's Dutch, he's from the Netherlands. He goes, you're sandbagging. I said, you're damn right. So he goes, okay, for sake of argument, 300 over 5, what do you think it's really going to be? I said, it's going to be over $1 billion. So I hedge my bets. It's when you talk about long-term scenario, I think it's prudent to talk about a long-term, a worst case, best case, and most likely case, because at least you then know the parameters on both sides. And I think it's a fair way of doing things. Again, you have to be very, very careful to list your assumptions, because as those assumptions change over time and you get better clarity running through the pipeline, you can tweak those. But if you don't list your assumptions, then it's subject to scrutiny. Now, somebody may not like your assumption, which is fine. You can, debate it, you can change it. But I think as long as everybody understands these are the assumptions we made going into this, then there's not a lot of room for argument.
Definitely. Yeah, that the long term resonates with me. I think my current job is a lot of, long term government projects. My company does 5-year integrated business plans. So we're always looking forward. So being able to kind of quantify that and at least understand the assumptions and what we know today is super important. We do have one question if you want to address it now, Jay,
Sure.
from Craig. In pharma, his team helped stop R&D on an early project, saving over $800 million. Can you talk about how similar qualitative discussions kind of reveal additional value in other industries?
Yeah, and I think what Craig is referring to is the sunk cost fallacy. And so you see projects going on. As a matter of fact, there's a great book out there called, it's right here on my desk, called Build by Tony Fadell. And most people know who Steve Jobs was, but they don't know who Tony Fadell is. Tony was the inventor and father of the iPod, the iPhone, Nest thermostats, and the Nest smoke detector. Tony is a true entrepreneur, and he's got a great book. I recommend it to anybody who really wants to understand management and scenarios and how you go about being creative, the whole ideation process. But Tony also talks about this, which I can relate to as well, which is a sunk cost fallacy. At some point in time, if a project is not going well, you have to actually take that hard step back and say, are we going to put more money into this? Or are we going to let it die? Because it's the old throwing good money after bad. And it takes a lot of courage to sit there and go like, you know what? This isn't going the way we thought. We need to really pull out of it. But there is that whole thing. And there's, if you go out to the internet and type in sunk cost fallacy, there are very strong papers written about that and how to recognize it. It goes way beyond the time we have for today. But, for people who want to know about that, it's a good thing to go look at.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you. So you talked, you mentioned this, but is there anything else you wanted to say about longer term projects as opposed to medium and short?
Again, I think it comes down to this type of chart here where you have to reduce the number of variables out there. You have to be able to quantify what those risks are, because there are risks the longer a project goes out. And especially, what I found with government projects and, with Lori Young and others being involved in that type of area, there tends to be a problem with scope creep or feature creep. And I think whenever you get into that environment, you have to, once something changes as a variable, like it could be time, it could be a feature, you have to readjust all of your timelines and reset expectations. Otherwise, the customer, the stakeholders is expecting you to deliver something on that old projection because you haven't changed. And I'm sure you see that all the time, Linda, as well, where somebody says, well, we're going to add these 5 features in, but I still want you to deliver on the old timeline. And that's just not realistic.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
So let me wrap up here and we can get to some of the questions, because it looks like we're on time, which is good. So again, very simple model. It's a framework. Establish your baseline, understand what you're measuring today. Put cost factors to that, assign cost to understand what's really costing you. Decide what you're going to do as far as an action and what is the benefit of that. And once you have that, you have the old, you have the new, then you can calculate the ROI. So it's worked out pretty well for my team. And again, when I showed this to people in Berlin last fall, they really loved the idea of the simplicity of the framework, of the model, of the approach. And again, like I said earlier, don't think of it as being the only approach. It is one approach that we have found successful, but also feel free to modify it, because you have to find something that works for your organization and your unique set of what's going on within your company.
Yeah, I think that's my main takeaway from this, Jay, is that it's manageable and it's easier than it seems when you first, see that calculation. It's a lot more straightforward than I think we may think. We may be overthinking it a little bit. So thank you for walking us through that.
Absolutely.
I think, does anyone else, we seem to have addressed most of the comments or questions. Thanks so much for everyone putting links to books or articles that Jay referenced. Any other questions from attendees? Feel free to speak up or put it in the chat, whatever is preferred.
And with that, I'm going to jump to this slide here. So the CI Fellows Summit, if you liked what I was talking about today, I'm actually moderating a panel next month at the CI Fellows Summit. And I'm going to have 4 people on my panel telling, the attendees, hopefully you're one of them, how they do measurement of ROI on the CI function within their organization. So we have panelists from AbbVie, we have panelists from Deloitte, we have panelists from Veeam, and somebody who just came from Freshworks. So great people. You'll get a diverse set of views based upon their experiences. And that's really what this is all about, is sharing our experiences with other practitioners. It gives you a way to network with other people as well. As you can see in the advertisement here, Craig managed to get Ben Gilad to come and help out. And if you don't know, Ben is one of the fathers of the competitive intelligence practice. He and Jan Herring and Lenny Folder really responsible for kicking off this industry of which we are part of. We're going to have things about winning strategies and wargaming, and also things around, Ascent. So hopefully you can all join us. It's a great use of money and time. I have attended as an attendee for the last 4 years, and it's been wonderful each year. You get a lot of good speakers and good insights from fellow practitioners, and also people from outside the CI practice. Like we had Rashad Tabakawala a couple of years ago, and Rashad, if you don't know, he's a guy in Chicago, very much a marketing person, but he has some great insights, and so I've personally found this to be beneficial and a good use of my time and my money for what it's worth.
Also, hopefully there's some good support with that. We do have one additional question in the chat. Mark Little is asking if C-suite's on board with this approach. Do they agree with the assumptions, calculations? Are they receptive to this, ROI calculation you brought to them for your
Yes.
CI? Okay.
Yes, this is how we justify our projects. This is how Michael and his executive leadership team look at it. They know that we've got a good track record. So, let me just give you one quick example. It's about building credibility, and you build the credibility by being ethical, by being honest. And if you make a mistake, that means honesty as well. But one of the projects we worked on, which was kind of a midterm project, is we had predicted by bringing in a particular platform for us to use, we expect to see between almost a doubling in sales revenue. We expected to see deals, the average deal size to be about 15K higher. And we expect to see deals close in about a month earlier than we previously had. We actually measure all that. We are fanatics about measuring stuff. And I can tell you, after doing this now with the platform for 7 years, we can tell you the statistics are very consistent. People who use our platform tend to have sales 3 times larger than the non-user. They tend to have deal sizes which are 50K larger. They tend to close deals 18 to 21 days sooner than their non-platform users. So, it's something about developing the credibility with the executives by showing that you are actually delivering. So as a result, this framework works well because we're stating everything up front. And anyone on the executive leadership team could say, "Well, I don't believe that." Okay, what do you think it is? And frankly, most of the time, unless it's something just really, really out there, it doesn't really materially affect the outcome anyway.
Hmm. Going back to sunk cost, Mark is asking, does it happen that ROIs tend to be positive when switching variable to fixed costs? I know you said positive is a good sign. Does that put us at risk of making things work the same way over time?
It can. If something happens and sunk costs, let's suppose you're working on a project and going down a project, at some point you know that this thing is not going to work. And so now you have the sunk cost fallacy you have to deal with. But you should have the fortitude to go and say, hey, we thought this was going to be the case. We need to pull the plug on it. No, the executives may not like that they spent some money on it, but I can tell you it's a lot better than continuing down the road and having it fail. Again, going back to my role as the skip chairman, I would talk with numerous practitioners out there and they said, yeah, we went too long and we damaged ourselves. So being vigilant about keeping an eye on the project costs. And if you find that some of the assumptions aren't working out, you have to be honest about it and take a look and see if it's something you want to continue doing.
I've definitely been in that position before, especially if it was my own idea. So you really just have to, this didn't work. Let's move on to something else. So
Yeah, it's tough, but I'm sure it's probably the same for you, Linnea. They actually respect the fact that you could be honest about that and say, okay, well, this isn't working. Let's not put any more money into it.
mhm. One more question.
Yes.
Building trusted relationships with leaders who embrace some friction that the CI team creates with them over strategic and tactical manners is tough to do in practice. Do you have any tips for our listeners on how to do that without completely risking your reputation? How do you kind of approach that situation? It sounds like you did that with Frank.
I always believe in having very straightforward conversations. And um, one of the things Ben Gilad taught me, which I think is invaluable, is that I was telling Ben, and so I can appreciate the thing about, damaging yourself, et cetera. I asked Ben about that one time and he goes like, well, what happened? And he goes, well, so and so and the product team asked about this. And I said, well, my opinion is, he goes, stop. He goes, that's where you screwed up. Because now they want to argue with your opinion. And so he goes, if they ask you a question and you answer in the sense of, this is how the competition will react, it's a much better way than saying my opinion. Because the minute you say it's your opinion, they want to sit there and argue with you because you just said it's your opinion. So that was one of the things that I wish I had known, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, because I think it would save a lot of very difficult conversations.
Sure. Additional question, sort of a solicitation from Yvonne. She's asking about suggested readings for CI, in particular the nonprofit world. I don't know if anyone else on the call is in the nonprofit world, but you mentioned a couple books, Jay, especially for this topic in particular, but anything else to suggest for the group on improving their knowledge base on these topics?
On the nonprofit side, I'll tell you what, the person you should reach out to is our old executive director of SKIP, Cam Mackey, Mackey. Cam is in the nonprofit side of things, and he can give you some great insights and suggestions on reading and, who to talk to. For a lot of us, this is really about networking, and that's what I think creates the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is probably all the questions we have. I want to make sure I didn't miss any. Jay, if anyone has additional questions, how, can they reach out to you on LinkedIn? How do you want them to go?
Definitely reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm out there. I think I'm the only Jay Nakagawa. So you can find me. You can also send me email at JAYT as in Tom, R as in Richard, P as in Peter, T as in Tom. That's an abbreviation, by the way, for trumpet, because I'm also a musician. And so you can send it to JAYTRPT@gmail.com.
Perfect. Thank you, Jay. And thanks everyone for attending and your participation. Like Jay said, this is definitely also about networking as much as knowledge sharing. So thank you to the Council of CI Fellows. I think this was definitely an interesting topic and is made better by the participation of everyone that attends. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Hope everyone has a great day.